This episode is made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. Fun fact, this is only the second time I've ever released a video late. It's an important topic, and I wanted to cover the conflict from an angle I haven't really seen yet. So I moved some release dates around to get this one out in a timely manner. Anyway, this episode is absolutely going to get demonetized, so if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Is Putin crazy? Probably. Most likely at least a little bit. Does it matter? Also yes. That's the short answer for this video that's going to end up being around 20 minutes long. The long answer, well, it's obviously more complicated than that. Let's talk about mainstream coverage of the conflict. Because this situation is fraught and constantly evolving, here's your disclaimer. Hit pause before you start fighting in the comments. And in case you didn't read it, this video isn't going to be defending Putin or Russia. The invasion/war in Ukraine is unequivocally wrong. Even if you were to take Russia's rhetoric about NATO expansion at face value, which, yes, NATO has been kicking the hornet's nest for some time now, this conflict is a dramatic, dangerous, and horrific overreaction. My heart goes out to the people of these two countries who will suffer terribly in a war they did not want. In this episode, I'm going to try and answer a couple of questions, like the one in the title, is Putin crazy? But I'll mostly be looking into why that question gets asked in the first place, how useful it is, both in the short and the long term, and what focusing on that question leaves out of the picture. This video is going to try to understand this whole situation a little bit better without getting into the specific details of the conflict. We're not going to rehash the whole history of Ukraine or Russia. We're not going to go into the details about Euromaidan or Crimea. We're going to look at the way we tell the story of the conflict, not the conflict itself. Significant chunks of this video will be speculative. Most analysis of the conflict is at this time, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, and I invite you to respond to this video and critique it to your heart's content. In any case, this video won't come down on a single conclusion for each topic, but rather put out a couple ideas and leave it up to you to decide what you want to take away. So, let's get back to Putin. Recently, this is the kind of coverage he's been getting.
He is just basking in his own hubris.
Do you think that he has it in him, and Putin in particular, to actually pull that lever, so to speak, or press that button?
Well, I personally think he's unhinged.
Senator Marco Rubio posted a tweet that caught my attention. He said, "I wish I could share more, but for now I can say it's pretty obvious to many that something is off with Putin. He has always been a killer, but his problem now is different and significant. It would be a mistake to assume this Putin would react the same way he would have 5 years ago."
Putin turns out to be far, far crazier than we had any idea.
Because he's a crazy psycho that is now a terrorist, a #1 terrorist in the world.
This is different. He seems erratic. There is an ever-deepening delusional rendering of history.
For a lot of observers, Putin does seem crazy. And there's some evidence that, in the short term, talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict by focusing on Putin being crazy has had some advantages. As we've seen, it is one of the factors that has brought a lot of nations together in supporting Ukraine, leveraging their military resources, economic power, and diplomatic platforms to criticize, deter, and weaken the Russian aggression. At least, that's the hope for the alliance led by the West. The positive outcome being, hopefully, a swift end to the conflict and to the immediate violence on the ground. A negative peace. Both within Russia and in cities all over the world, we've seen protests against the war and against Putin himself. There's no doubt that that kind of public support is justifying and being used as justification for the response to Russia. It is fueling the image of Putin as a deranged maniac that needs to be stopped right away. So far, that framing has been effective in souring public opinion on the conflict and pushing for peace talks, though with some important limitations we'll get to in a second. There's also the nuclear issue. The fear that has been stoked by Putin's escalating rhetoric around nuclear weapons. Specifically, the idea that a deranged Putin could press the button no one with any shred of sanity would ever press has likely contributed to the haste with which bystander countries have pushed for diplomatic resolutions to the conflict. It is incredibly scary to imagine nuclear warfare breaking out, and people know that and will do anything to avoid it. This, again, will hopefully mean a quick return to a negative peace between the two countries, but is of course a net positive for Russian interests, which can leverage this situation for an upper hand in negotiations. That upper hand might force Ukraine to make significant concessions, ultimately giving Russia territorial or other gains without the invading country needing to get them through the more quote-unquote conventional use of total occupation. There is a chance that Putin knows this and is exploiting what's called the Madman Theory. He knows that threatening nuclear warfare is not credible to anybody who rationally balances out the pros, minor territorial, symbolic, and economic victories, with the cons, the annihilation of the human species. So he is purposefully playing up the image of a madman who can't rationally balance these two sides. Acting convincingly crazy gives him the upper hand in negotiations because it makes nuclear warfare seem like it could be real, even though it is utterly irrational. For the West and Ukraine, this poses a challenge of how to respond to Putin. On the one hand, treating the nuclear threat at face value gets countries to the negotiation table quickly, but on unequal terms. On the other, it makes military support and intervention complicated. In one theory, it slows down any sort of Western military action. If Putin is crazy and his biggest perceived threat is NATO, pushing his buttons will lead us straight into nuclear Armageddon, so the West should not intervene. According to another way of thinking, if Putin is crazy, everything is on the table to stop him, so the West has to intervene. The latter, by the way, is the kind of logic that comes up when people are asked how we should deal with terrorists. According to an experiment by Princeton researchers, if test subjects are told that terrorists are bloodthirsty fanatics, maniacs ready to spill the blood of millions of people, they are more likely to advocate for unilateral military responses and, removal attempts. When terrorists are presented as rational, they're more likely to advocate for negotiation. These two ideas, the Madman Theory and the terrorist example, are contradictory. In one theory, being crazy gets you to the negotiation table. In the other, it's being sane that gets you negotiating. The big reason for that difference is nuclear weapons. When you have to factor in the death and destruction of everyone and everything you love, how you treat an irrational actor is very different. This puts the West and its media institutions in a complicated position. Treat Putin as a madman and you can justify your role in this war. You can play off the fear and frustration that gets ordinary people to start thinking about what would happen if Putin was removed tomorrow. But it also means you'll have to negotiate against the guy with the upper hand. Treat him like a rational actor who would never ever detonate a nuclear weapon, and you risk getting it wrong like you did with this invasion. Except this time, the consequence is nuclear annihilation. Because remember that less than a month ago, Putin's threats to invade Ukraine weren't thought of as very credible to many outside observers. Even for those who warned of Russian aggression, the idea that so much of the country, including Kyiv, would be bombed didn't seem likely. Putin knows this. He knows how his unpredictability shapes the responses he gets, and is purposefully leveraging it. That or he's genuinely deranged. We might never know. I'll give you my thoughts at the end. Overall, treating Putin as a deranged warmonger seems to have been a rough net positive, at least up to this point and in the short term. More important caveats coming soon. On the whole, it has been a key factor in stopping nuclear warfare from breaking out, assuming that threat was at the very least possible, and it has created urgency around diplomatic resolution, even if on extortionary terms. That is certainly better than the alternative: nuclear annihilation or never-ending conflict. Unfortunately, the forest might start getting lost in the trees depending on how the rest of this short-term response is carried out. In the scramble to arm Ukraine, Western countries may be creating a new Afghanistan. The West could be arming paramilitary organizations which, once the immediate conflict is settled, could pose an internal threat, and would inevitably be used to justify more lethal aid, more interventions, and more imperialist aggression, the kind we've seen ravage the Middle East for decades. What Western countries see as the most reasonable short-term response, giving Ukraine the means to defend itself against a much more powerful aggressor, may lead to unintended consequences. Or hell, maybe they are intended, I wouldn't be surprised. Consequences that could bring proxy imperialist wars back to the forefront of international relations in the long term. There's also a concern that treating Putin like this has actually done the opposite of the escalate to de-escalate strategy, with some still very minor today, but nonetheless present voices calling for a preemptive strike or a full-scale NATO involvement. Again, this is highly speculative. Thinking about the short term with so many competing narratives and the uncertainty surrounding Putin's mental state leads to an impossible number of forks and alternative histories, many of them terrifying to imagine. When thinking about the long term, then, it may be beneficial to subscribe to a different way of telling history. Instead of focusing on the individual, and therefore subscribing to the great man theory of history, the idea that history is shaped by great leaders above all else, it may be better to understand the conflict from a more institutional, economic, and materialistic approach. A historical materialism of some sort, if that was even a real thing. I've certainly never heard of it. And before we do, just to be clear, focusing on Putin at a time like this is not entirely wrong. Putin sits at the helm of a country he has profoundly shaped for over 2 decades. The way Russia acts in most affairs does usually boil down to whatever Putin says, because his status as an autocrat grants him far more decision-making power than any one person should ever have. The point of a historical materialist approach isn't to deny that, but to explain how it is that he gets to have such a strong decision-making power in the first place, and what factors exist that guide and constrain, or alternatively give him carte blanche when he is exercising it. At the time of writing, some people are predicting that the heavy costs of sanctions and military operations against Russia will make Putin incredibly unpopular at home and abroad, possibly ending up with him not leading Russia anymore. If that is the case, if Putin does leave office, our fixation on him and him alone may lead to an overconfidence in the stability of whatever peace we hopefully get on the other side. Just because Putin is out of the picture doesn't mean everything is okay. So our analysis of the conflict must also take into account what will survive after Putin is gone. Let's give that a shot. Thus far, the analysis of the Ukraine-Russia conflict has been done on 2 big lines. According to the liberal philosophy of international relations, this conflict has been driven by ideas and international institutions. Putin is committed to the idea of a unified Russian identity inherited from the USSR and the greater history of Russian nations. Putin wants Ukraine, or at least part of it, because he is interested in uniting all people who are tied to the Russian identity and history they share. Debates in liberal circles are over the degree to which Ukrainians in the east of the country are really more like Russians, and whether that's sufficient justification for the breach of international law. Usually, in the West at least, their answer is no. The other line of thinking, what is usually called the realist philosophy of international relations, sees this conflict in terms of military power and influence. Russia is invading Ukraine to keep the country as a barrier to NATO expansion and the threat of being undermined by a strong military at its borders in the future. Likewise, the realist analysis on the other side is that Russia is taking over Ukraine to expand its own influence and destabilize the EU. Debates here are about what threat NATO or Russia actually poses in terms of influence and military power. While there is an element of truth to both these philosophies, especially because different political leaders are desperately trying to make either one seem more true by acting as if it was, the third, less popular approach to this conflict is through the Marxist analysis of international relations. That's the historical materialism I mentioned earlier. This analysis tends to focus on the way in which economics and economic institutions play a role in explaining this war, and more generally sees economic motivations as the foundation upon which politics generally, and liberal and realist philosophies more specifically, can play out in the first place. Each theory is basically competing about which one comes first, not really about which one gets it right. They all kind of get part of it right in one way or another. Marxists see this conflict as being the consequence of an accumulation of economic and political power into a few hands. Following the fall of the USSR, the liberalization of Russia was dominated by the privatization of industries previously under state control. In their place, oligarchs who were either well-connected in the former USSR or exceedingly capable of navigating the newly liberalized economy consolidated major sectors of the economy, notably fossil fuels, into their very few hands. Thanks to this concentrated economic power, they were able to have a high degree of influence on politics, carrying Putin and his support for their endeavors into the highest office, from which he could carry national economic policy in a few key directions, specifically to enrich his buddies, while they both kept one another on a tight leash. It shouldn't be surprising that this is an unstable economic system, especially given how central a few key, non-renewable resources are to the whole operation. Unlike the countries to its west, Russia did not benefit from a Marshall Plan that would have bolstered its capitalist economy within a strong network of cooperation with the big daddy of global economics, the US. Russia's privatization and primitive accumulation came with all the pitfalls and punishments of liberalism unadulterated, creating a punishing austerity for the general population, but lucrative profits for a few at the top. This allowed for and promoted a single figurehead with visions of expansion at its helm, because when domestic crises begin in a capitalist society, they'll often turn towards nationalism and look at outward expansion for solutions. Of course, Russia isn't in a vacuum. While all this is happening, Ukraine is modernizing its agriculture and energy sources, cutting off Russian gas slowly, taking its role as a channel for Russian gas for the rest of Europe slowly off the table, and proving the value of its rich black soil, an incredibly fertile ground and a major source of profit. These are trends that Russian oligarchs have kept an eye on for a long time, threatening their profits the further away Ukraine gets from them, and a big reason to keep courting Ukrainian politicians. And look, I may not have all the details. Like most of you, this wasn't on my radar just a few weeks ago, and the quote, real motivations behind this war are anybody's guess at this point. But if you think this sort of materialist analysis has some weight, you can see how focusing on Putin alone might pose an issue for the future. Once Putin is gone, that is, if Putin is gone, the economic relations between different countries in Europe and within Russia and its oligarchs will not disappear. There will be a tense relationship between Russia, a country with an economy dependent on resources many countries are trying to make obsolete, and the rest of Europe, increasingly wary of the influence and economic struggle Russia can create by turning off the gas. In that sense, while the character of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is entirely his own, the motivations that have pushed Putin into war precede him and any recent changes in international politics. He made the decision, an awful one, but the prevailing economic system and the specific way in which it was imposed on the post-USSR countries, with highly concentrated economic and political power in the hands of a few oligarchs, created the conditions in which Putin could make his decision and hope for it to be a good one for his economic interests. Really awful economic interests at that. To summarize this whole video, personalizing this conflict and making it about Putin makes sense in the short term. Over the long term, it doesn't become irrelevant, but it isn't nearly so central. Putin and the Ukraine-Russia war can therefore also be seen as a warning call for other countries with increasingly monopolistic capitalist economies and political systems prone to autocratic co-optation. When the scramble for resources begins, a network of genuine solidarity between ordinary, working people has the best chance of staving off war. The same can't be said of a global network based on maximizing profits and national competition with a handful of all-powerful people calling the shots. We can make pragmatic decisions in the short term, but should never lose sight of that fact. For what it's worth, I don't think Putin is crazy, but I do think he's been in power a long time and has grown accustomed to doing whatever he wants, regardless of what his advisors have to say. Finally, as a last addendum, don't try to use bits and pieces of this analysis to justify any sort of imperialism, whether that's whatever Putin's Russia is doing or sending Western intervention into Ukraine. There is no justification for the violence we've seen and for calls to escalate. We can understand the motivations and economic context that has made our current situation more likely without falling into deterministic thinking, that is, assuming all this was destined to happen, or believing these actions are justified. They are not. War isn't a spectator sport as the internet would have you believe. It's not a Marvel movie with clearly defined good guys and bad guys. We should not be rooting for one army to massacre another. Those soldiers don't stand to gain anything from this conflict. They're normal people just like you and me. The only people who will come out on top are those at the levers of power of the bloodthirsty imperialist nations. All we should be calling for is for this conflict to be resolved quickly, without a ransacking of Ukraine, without nuclear weapons being detonated, without the expansion of NATO, and through diplomacy. No war but class war. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to help me produce more content like it, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server, where you can find a recommended reading list, a book club, and lots of other great people looking to make friends and learn from each other. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I literally could not keep this channel running without you. So thank you, and I'll see you next week.